We all know that the Wacky Rig is one of the most fish catching machines, one of the best lures that you can use. Whether you are just getting started in bass fishing or you've been fishing your entire life, a Wacky Rig gets the job done. It catches bass when they're biting and it catches bass when they're not biting. And today I'm gonna give you 3 tips to help you catch a few more bass on a Wacky Rig. So stay tuned, it's gonna be a good one. This video is brought to you by sportsmansoutfitters.com. Sportsman's Outfitters is the place that I like to shop. Something that is really cool about Sportsman's Outfitters right now is that we are running a sale that if you use the coupon code BFHQ10, you can actually get 10% off any ARC fishing rod. Today I'm fishing with an ARC Cobb Series spinning rod. It's extremely light, extremely sensitive. It's got this cool little grip and it's only $90 with that coupon code. So if you're interested in picking up a new rod, use that coupon code and get 10% off any ARC fishing rod. Now, before we get into the tips of a Wacky Rig, I'm gonna go over how I set up a Wacky Rig real quick because this is probably one of the most asked questions that I get on the channel altogether is what's your rod, what's your reel, what's your line, how do you set it up, what pound test, what hook, all those type of things. So let's set up a Wacky Rig really quick. I would say that 95% of the time I'm going to use a Wacky Rig on a spinning rod. And the only time that I really don't use it on a spinning rod is kind of if I'm like really up in the cover, if I'm up in bushes or if I'm up in pads, for instance, and I'm actually more or less flipping a Wacky Rig around, I might use a bait cast rod then. But for the most part, I'm going to use a spinning rod. Now, my all-around go-to spinning rod that I use for a number of different techniques is this rod right here. It's a 7-foot 1-inch medium power rod. It's an extra fast action rod, although it has a little bit more of a fast action. That gives me plenty of tip to really be able to cast and skip a Wacky Rig wherever I need it to be, as well as enough backbone to actually get big fish out of heavy cover when I need to. Now, my spinning reel of choice is this Tatula LT spinning reel. I typically like the 2500 series reels. A lot of guys like 3000 series, and I like that 2500. Now, pretty much anytime I'm fishing with a spinning rod, I'm using braid to a fluorocarbon leader, and it's no different with the Wacky Rig. I use 10-pound test braided line to a 10-pound test fluorocarbon leader. Now, I use 10-pound fluorocarbon, I would say most of the time, but this presentation, you can really use any line you want. You can use 12-pound, you can use 15-pound, you can even use 20-pound line for your Wacky Rig. That Wacky Rig will not have as natural of an action the higher pound test that you go. But for me, I really like that 10-pound fluorocarbon. It's really perfect all around. I'm gonna connect my braid and fluorocarbon typically with a crazy Alberto knot. This is an easy knot. It's a very small, thin knot, and I can tie it extremely quickly. Oh yeah, when it comes to leader length, usually I'm about 10 or 12 foot with a Wacky Rig. I have used a ton of different hooks, and I have come to the conclusion that your hook doesn't really matter. I think that if you are hooking up with the fish that bite and you're landing them, stick with whatever hook that you want. And the reason that I say this is if you look at some of the professional bass fishermen who are extremely good with the Wacky Rig, guys like John Cox, guys like David Dudley, they all use really different hooks. John Cox uses a pretty small wide gap hook, and then you have David Dudley who actually uses a lot bigger hook. And so I don't think it really matters. The important part is that if a fish bites and you hook up with that fish and you land the fish, then you don't have to change your hook. Now for me, I've kind of been on the trend of using a little bit bigger hook, like a David Dudley size hook here. This is a 1/0 Gamakatsu finesse straight shank hook. Honestly, this is the hook that I choose for right now, but like I said, I've used Trokar Wacky Rig hooks and they've worked fine. I always just kind of like to experiment, and I just don't think it really matters. And for those of you who want to know what kind of knot that is a double Pitson. Now, the one thing I will say about a hook is that if you like to just stick your hook in your Wacky Rig worm, kind of like this is actually the way that I do. The one thing you want to make sure you do is use a little bit thicker gauge wire hook. If you use too thin of a hook on your Wacky Rig, you're going to lose a ton of soft plastics because that thin hook can really slice through that soft plastic. Now, I'm not saying you need to use a tuna hook. I'm just saying a little bit thicker gauge makes all the difference in the world. Now, if you like to use an O-ring, this really doesn't matter. Final part of the setup is the worm itself, and there's really two worms that I throw. One is going to be your Senko style bait. For instance, this is a Gary Yamamoto Senko. The other one is a trick worm style bait. It's a little bit thinner like this. It's a little bit longer, but both of these, when wacky rigged, have a really cool, unique fall that the bass can't stand. So now that you know the setup, I want to get into a few tips that I think will help you to put more bass in the boat. And the first tip actually comes down to the way that you work a wacky rig. I have two really distinct ways that I work a wacky rig, and honestly, they are on completely different sides of the spectrum. The first one is going to be the one that most guys use, and that is where you let the bait do its own thing. This is where I'm going to cast my bait to a target, whether that's underneath of a dock or by a tree, and I'm gonna let that bait just slowly fall. And I'm making sure that when I do this, I give that bait complete 100% slack line. I want that bait to just completely fall very naturally. I'm gonna let it hit the bottom, and I'm gonna let it sit there for a few seconds, and then I'm gonna pop it up and then let it fall all over again. And usually I'm gonna do that 2 or 3 times, and then I'm gonna move on to my next target. That is probably the most popular way to work a wacky rig, and you can catch a ton of bass that way. Now, the other way that I work a wacky rig is something that I don't see a lot of guys doing, and I actually work this a lot like I do a floating worm. And basically what I'm doing is I'm going to work it pretty fast just below the surface. I'm actually gonna cast this bait out, and as soon as it hits the water, I'm gonna twitch that bait about 2 or 3 times, and then I'm gonna let it sink just about 6 inches, and that's it. And then I'm gonna twitch it another 2 or 3 times, and I'm gonna let it drop about 6 inches. The entire time that I work this bait, I can visibly see my Senko. I'm working it just below the surface of the water. Usually it doesn't get more than a foot below the surface of the water. And I'm telling you what, if you have not tried fishing a wacky rig this way, you need to do it. There are days out there on the water where bass want that wacky rig really, really fast and just below the surface. And it's one of the most fun bites because it's extremely visual. Like I said, it's just like fishing a floating worm where you see that bait the entire time and those bass just come up there and absolutely crush it. So those are the 2 ways to work a wacky rig. Pretty much anything in between, I don't ever do. Now, the next tip for fishing a wacky rig actually involves where you fish this rig. Now, I think a lot of people fish a wacky rig in just a few areas. One is going to be underneath of a dock. A ton of people will fish this bait underneath of a dock, and for good reason, right? Because you can skip a wacky rig extremely well underneath of a dock. But one of my favorite places to fish this, and a place where I don't see a lot of guys fishing a wacky rig, is actually on riprap banks. Something that's extremely annoying about fishing riprap is that no matter if you're fishing a jig, a crankbait, a spinnerbait, you're gonna get hung up a lot, you know, and there are baits that come through riprap a little bit better. You know, crankbaits don't always get hung up, but you're still going to get hung up from time to time, especially if you use a sinking lure like a jig. Now, with that being said, the wacky rig is one of those few lures that you can fish pretty well on riprap, and I just don't see a lot of guys doing this. You know, if you let that bait fall down, it's gonna shimmy down just like this, and it literally just will land on top of the rocks, and it's not usually going to get down inside of the crevices where you typically will lose other baits. It's actually a really effective way to catch bass, especially during that spawn and post-spawn time. So if you see a riprap bank, don't just go and pick up a crankbait like everybody else. Try actually throwing a wacky rig, especially if you have really calm conditions, because I'm telling you what, a wacky rig will come through that riprap extremely well. Now, the last tip when it comes to fishing a wacky rig is maybe less of a tip and more of trying to answer a question that I see a lot when it comes to fishing a wacky rig. And the biggest thing that I see, one of the biggest questions I see is, do you put weight on your wacky rig or do you fish it weightless? And to be honest, I do both. And to also be honest, There are days when you fish it and it literally doesn't matter. If you have a little jig head like a flick shake and you're attached it to a Wacky Rig, there are days that no matter if you fish it weightless or with that little flick shake, that you're going to get the exact same amount of bite. For me, I typically use a weight when I just want to be more efficient. For instance, if I'm fishing in a little bit deeper water and I know that those fish are on the bottom, that's typically when I use a weighted hook of some sort, like a flick shake. You know, if I'm fishing a dock that's in 7, 8, 9 foot of water, but I know those fish are on the bottom, then I'm gonna use a little bit heavier weight because I just want to get that bait to the bottom. Now, if those fish are suspended on those docks, then I'm not going to use a weight. I'm going to use it weightless and let that bait just kind of glide down in front where that bass can pick it off. Now, pretty much anytime I am fishing shallower, I'm not going to use a weight. I'm just gonna use it weightless. Now, one of the best Wacky Rig lures, as we know, is the Yamamoto Senko. And I actually did a video all about a Senko. I'm gonna link it right here. So if you guys enjoyed this video, I think you will enjoy this one as well. Also, don't forget to pick up your tackle and supplies at Sportsman's Outfitters. Comment on the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you guys in the next video.